The echo of prejudice. The sunlight filtered through the large arched windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, casting streaks of gold across the polished oak floors. Monday mornings in the courthouse were a blend of controlled chaos and monotonous routine. The hallways buzzed with a cacophony of voices, lawyers arguing with clients, clerks shuffling through files, and the occasional outburst from someone who'd clearly had enough of the judicial system. Presiding in courtroom 7A was Judge Henry Wallace, a man known for his strict demeanor and an infamous reputation for passing harsh judgments, particularly when the defendants didn't fit into his narrow worldview. To some, he was a paragon of discipline, someone who didn't mince words or waste time. To others, he was a tyrant in a robe, wielding his gavel as though it were a scepter of unchecked power. This particular morning, the gallery was packed. The energy in the room was tense, an invisible current of unease buzzing through the air. Judge Wallace's sharp voice echoed off the walls as he barked orders, reprimanding lawyers for tardiness and defendants for poor courtroom etiquette. The clerk, a petite woman with horn-rimmed glasses, called the next case. Case 22,487. Nicole Turner, traffic violation. The defendant stepped forward. Nicole Turner was a striking black woman in her early 40s, her posture erect and her expression calm but focused. Dressed in a charcoal gray blazer paired with matching slacks, she looked more like a professional arriving for a meeting than a defendant facing a charge. Her braids were neatly styled, and she carried a black leather briefcase that seemed oddly out of place for a traffic court appearance. Judge Wallace barely glanced up from the file before him. "Miss Turner, you've been charged with reckless driving, failure to yield, and causing a minor collision. Do you wish to contest these charges?" Nicole took a steady breath, her voice composed but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like the opportunity to clarify the circumstances." Wallace cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand, not bothering to let her finish. "This is a courtroom, not a forum for excuses, Miss Turner. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" Nicole's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she nodded. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge finally looked up, his piercing gray eyes locking onto hers. There was a moment of silence, one that felt longer than it was. Wallace had a way of making people feel small, of asserting his dominance with a single glance. But Nicole didn't shrink under his scrutiny. Her gaze remained steady, unyielding. Wallace smirked, a flicker of condescension crossing his face. "Very well. Trial is set for next week. In the meantime, I see no reason to grant leniency. You're fined $1,500. Payable within 30 days. Next case." The gavel came down with a resounding thud, punctuating the conversation and signaling the end of Nicole's moment before the bench. The courtroom murmured as she turned to leave, her steps deliberate and confident. There was no slouching, no sign of defeat. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in her shoulders, a quiet storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. From his seat, Wallace watched her retreat, a sliver of unease piercing through his otherwise impenetrable demeanor. Something about her unsettled him, not in a way that he could articulate, but in a way that gnawed at the back of his mind. Still, he brushed it off, chalking it up to the frustration of a Monday morning packed with trivial cases. As the day wore on, Wallace forgot about Nicole Turner. His courtroom cycled through its usual parade of defendants. People desperate, indifferent, or openly defiant. By lunchtime, his mind was cluttered with case files, verdicts, and the occasional reprimand for attorneys who dared to challenge his authority. Meanwhile, Nicole Turner exited the courthouse into the crisp autumn air. She paused on the courthouse steps, her eyes scanning the bustling street below. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried by, and the world moved on as though nothing significant had happened. But for Nicole, this morning's encounter with Judge Wallace was more than just a routine court appearance. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. A notification from her office buzzed, reminding her of an important meeting scheduled for the afternoon. She smirked faintly, her thoughts racing ahead to what was coming. The encounter in the courtroom had been just a prelude, a fleeting chapter in a much larger story. For now, she walked to her car, a sleek, black SUV parked neatly in the corner of the lot. As she slid into the driver's seat, she didn't dwell on the judge's dismissive tone or the hefty fine. She had more pressing matters to attend to, ones that would shift the dynamics in ways Judge Wallace couldn't yet imagine. Inside the courthouse, Judge Wallace's afternoon proceeded as usual. The courtroom saw a flurry of minor cases, each one blending into the next in an endless stream of rulings. But as the day waned, a case file landed on his desk that pulled him from the monotony. It was one of the most high-profile cases the county had seen in years, a corporate fraud trial involving a prominent real estate mogul accused of embezzling millions from investors. Wallace skimmed the file, noting the names of the legal teams involved. His brow furrowed as he landed on the lead prosecutor's name, Nicole Turner. His pen froze mid-note. For a moment, he thought it must be a mistake. The defendant from earlier couldn't possibly be the same Nicole Turner listed in this file, and yet the title beside her name was unmistakable: Chief Prosecutor, Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. Wallace leaned back in his chair, the realization settling over him like a cold shadow. He hadn't just underestimated her, he'd outright dismissed her, reduced her to a stereotype, and fined her as though she were another cog in the machinery of his courtroom. Now, she was returning, not as a defendant, but as a commanding force in the most pivotal trial on his docket, a battle of wits. The afternoon sun bathed the courthouse in a golden glow, but inside the walls of courtroom 7A, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Nicole Turner strode into the courtroom with an air of confidence that was impossible to ignore. Dressed in a tailored burgundy suit that exuded professionalism and authority, she carried herself with the poise of someone who knew the weight of her role. This wasn't the Nicole Turner Judge Wallace had seen that morning. Gone was the reserved woman fined for a traffic violation. In her place stood the Chief Prosecutor of Jefferson County, ready to lead a high-profile trial that had already garnered the attention of local and national media. Reporters lined the back of the room, their notebooks and cameras poised to capture every word, every shift in posture, every glance exchanged. Judge Wallace, seated behind his imposing mahogany bench, adjusted his glasses as Nicole set her papers down at the prosecution's table. He felt a twinge of discomfort, not because of the case, but because of her. The memory of their earlier interaction gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, a reminder of how easily he'd dismissed her without a second glance. Now, she commanded the room in a way that left no doubt about her capabilities. Nicole's co-counsel leaned in, whispering something that made her nod briefly. Her demeanor was calm, deliberate, and focused. She didn't so much as glance in Judge Wallace's direction, her attention wholly devoted to the case at hand. It was as if their earlier encounter hadn't happened, or perhaps it had, and she'd simply chosen to rise above it. The defendant entered the courtroom flanked by a team of high-priced lawyers, their sharp suits and designer briefcases a testament to their client's wealth and influence. David Grant, a silver-haired real estate mogul accused of embezzling millions, wore an expression that hovered somewhere between defiance and disdain. To him, this trial was merely a nuisance, a temporary setback in an otherwise untouchable life. Nicole, however, intended to change that. "Court is now in session," the clerk announced, her voice cutting through the hum of anticipation. The Honorable Judge Henry Wallace presiding. Wallace rapped his gavel, calling the room to order. "Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" Nicole stood, her presence commanding yet unhurried. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." The defense attorney, a wiry man named Martin Vickers with a reputation for his cunning tactics, rose from his seat. "The defense is ready as well, Your Honor." Wallace nodded, gesturing for the opening statements to begin. "Miss Turner, you may proceed." Nicole stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She addressed the jury, her voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we will uncover a story of betrayal, betrayal of trust, of responsibility, and of the very principles that uphold our justice system. Her words were measured, each syllable carefully chosen to resonate with the jurors. The evidence will show that Mr. Grant, a man entrusted with the investments of countless individuals, exploited that trust for personal gain, siphoning millions to fund his extravagant lifestyle. As she spoke, her eyes moved from one juror to the next, forging connections that seemed to anchor her words in their minds. This case is not about wealth or power. It is about accountability. It is about ensuring that no one, no matter how influential, is above the law. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of reporters' pens and the occasional click of a camera shutter. Even Wallace found himself drawn in, his earlier misgivings momentarily eclipsed by her command of the room. When Nicole concluded her statement, she returned to her seat without a glance at the defense table. Martin Vickers, however, was already on his feet, eager to dismantle the foundation she'd laid. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Vickers began, his tone smooth and calculated, "what we have here is not a case of criminal intent, but rather a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. My client, Mr. Grant, has been a pillar of this community for decades. He has built homes, created jobs, and contributed generously to countless charities. The evidence will show that any discrepancies in his financial dealings were unintentional and easily rectifiable." Wallace watched as Vickers wove his narrative, his words painting Grant as a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of greed. The jury listened intently, their expressions neutral but attentive. Nicole, for her part, remained unfazed, her pen moving briskly across her notepad as she prepared for what was to come. The trial unfolded with methodical precision. Nicole presented her case with a meticulousness that bordered on surgical. She introduced emails, financial records, and witness testimonies that painted a damning picture of Grant's actions. Each piece of evidence was a thread, and Nicole wove them together into an unassailable tapestry of guilt. Her cross-examinations were equally impressive. When Grant's former accountant took the stand, Nicole's questions sliced through the man's prepared answers like a scalpel, exposing inconsistencies that bolstered her case. She was relentless but never cruel, her tone firm but respectful. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady, "are you asking this court to believe that millions of dollars were diverted from investor accounts without your knowledge, despite the fact that you personally approved every transaction?" The accountant squirmed, his collar suddenly too tight. I trusted the system. I didn't think." "Exactly," Nicole interrupted, her voice rising just enough to emphasize her point. "You didn't think, and because of that negligence, countless families lost their savings. People's lives were ruined. Isn't that correct?" The witness hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. The defense tried to counter with their own witnesses, but Nicole's preparation was impeccable. She anticipated their arguments, dismantling them with precision, and leaving little room for doubt. Through it all, Wallace found himself watching her closely. She was everything he claimed to value in his courtroom: disciplined, intelligent, and unwavering in her pursuit of justice. And yet, he couldn't ignore the dissonance between the respect she commanded now and the dismissal she'd endured earlier. It was a humbling realization, one that gnawed at his conscience. As the trial stretched into its third day, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. Nicole's closing argument loomed, and everyone knew it would be the final test of her case. The jury was attentive, the reporters eager, and Wallace. Wallace was curious about how this woman, whom he had so grossly underestimated, would bring it all together. When the time came, Nicole rose from her seat and walked to the center of the courtroom. She stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle before she began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice low but resonant, "you have seen the evidence, you have heard the testimonies, and you have witnessed the lengths to which the defense has gone to obscure the truth. But the truth is undeniable." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Mr. Grant is not a victim of circumstance. He is a man who made deliberate choices, choices that betrayed the trust of those who depended on him, choices that have real consequences for real people. Her words were powerful, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were true. The jurors leaned forward, captivated by her sincerity. In this courtroom, Nicole continued, her voice steady, justice is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is a right, a principle, and a promise. And today, you have the power to uphold that promise. When she finished, the room was silent. The defense made their closing statement, but it lacked the impact of Nicole's words. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied, leaving only the weight of what had transpired. Wallace retreated to his chambers, his thoughts heavy. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, a twinge of regret, not for the trial itself, but for how he had failed to see Nicole Turner for who she truly was. A force of justice, a woman of integrity, and a reminder that even the most seasoned judge could still learn. The turning point. The third day of the trial brought with it a heightened sense of anticipation. The morning sunlight, usually a welcome reprieve from the courthouse's solemn atmosphere, seemed muted. Inside courtroom 7A, the tension was palpable. Every creak of the benches and shuffle of papers amplified by the weight of what was at stake. Nicole Turner entered the room with the same composed confidence she had maintained throughout the trial. Today, however, there was a slight shift in her demeanor, a quiet determination that hinted at the significance of the day ahead. Her tailored navy suit, paired with a crisp white blouse, mirrored her professional poise. She greeted her team with a few quiet words, her presence a calming force amid the flurry of last-minute preparations. Judge Henry Wallace watched her from the bench, his expression unreadable. Over the past 2 days, he had been unable to ignore the growing admiration he felt for her professionalism, her preparation, and the unwavering resolve with which she pursued justice. And yet, the memory of their first interaction lingered, a reminder of his own failings. The courtroom filled quickly, reporters taking their usual places in the back, their notebooks and cameras ready to capture the drama. The defendant, David Grant, entered next, his face a carefully composed mask of indifference. His team of attorneys surrounded him like a fortress, their whispered conversations brimming with strategies for what they hoped would be a final push to discredit the prosecution. When the court was called to order, the first witness of the day was summoned. Nicole approached the podium with her notepad in hand, her gaze steady as the bailiff swore in a former employee of Grant's company, a junior financial analyst named Sarah Connolly. Connolly's testimony was expected to be critical. She was the one who had discovered the discrepancies in the accounts, the one who had blown the whistle on the embezzlement. "Ms. Connolly," Nicole began, her voice calm but firm, "you were employed at Grant Enterprises for 3 years, correct?" "Yes," Connolly replied, her voice trembling slightly. "And during your tenure, you were responsible for auditing the financial records?" Connolly nodded. "Yes, that's correct." Nicole stepped closer, her tone softening just enough to put the witness at ease. "Can you describe what you discovered during one of those audits? Specifically, the discrepancies that led you to report your findings?" Connolly hesitated, glancing nervously at the defense table. Grant's cold gaze bore into her, a silent reminder of the power he once held over her career. Nicole noticed the hesitation and took a step closer, her voice steady but empathetic. "Ms. Connolly, take your time. You're here to tell the truth. No one can intimidate you in this courtroom." The reassurance seemed to steady Connolly. She took a deep breath and began. "I found a series of transfers, large sums of money, being moved into accounts that didn't match any of our registered clients or vendors. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I dug deeper, I realized the accounts were linked to entities owned by Mr. Grant." The courtroom murmured, the weight of her words rippling through the room. Wallace rapped his gavel for silence, but his eyes lingered on Nicole. Her ability to create a space where the truth could emerge was remarkable. "Did you confront anyone about this?" Nicole asked, her voice unwavering. "Yes," Connolly replied, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I brought it up to my supervisor, but I was told to ignore it. They said it wasn't my concern. And what happened after you reported your findings to authorities? Connolly hesitated again, her voice dropping. I was fired. Nichol let the silence linger for a moment, the gravity of the statement hanging in the air. Then she nodded. Thank you, Ms. Connolly. No further questions. The defense wasted no time trying to dismantle Connolly's credibility. Vickers, their lead attorney, approached the stand with a smug confidence, his questions designed to paint her as an unreliable employee with a grudge. But Nichol had anticipated this. Her cross-examinations and evidence had built an unshakable narrative, and Vickers' attempts to undermine it only served to reinforce the strength of her case. By midday, the courtroom was buzzing. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, had painted a damning picture of Grant's greed and betrayal. Yet, as the trial moved into the afternoon, Nichol knew the defense would make their final play. She also knew she had to be ready for it. The defense called their star witness, a forensic accountant who claimed that the financial discrepancies were the result of accounting errors, not embezzlement. The man was polished and confident, his testimony calculated to sow doubt in the jury's minds. Nichol listened intently, her pen moving briskly across her notepad. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand with a calm intensity that immediately shifted the room's energy. Mr. Reynolds, she began, addressing the witness with a polite nod, you've stated that the discrepancies were accounting errors. Can you confirm whether these errors all resulted in funds being transferred to accounts linked to Mr. Grant? Reynolds hesitated. Well, the accounts were unusual, but errors happen. Nichol interrupted, her tone sharper now. Errors happen, yes, but isn't it statistically improbable for every single error to funnel money into accounts controlled by one individual? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I suppose that could be considered unusual. Unusual, Nichol repeated, her voice dripping with controlled skepticism. Mr. Reynolds, in your professional opinion, would you consider it ethical for a CEO to personally benefit from such errors without reporting them to investors? Reynolds faltered, his polished demeanor cracking under her relentless questioning. No, that wouldn't be ethical. Nichol took a step back, her expression calm but resolute. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. No further questions. The courtroom was silent as she returned to her seat. Wallace watched her closely, his admiration growing with each passing moment. She was relentless in her pursuit of justice, but never at the expense of integrity. It was a lesson he hadn't realized he needed. As the day drew to a close, the trial's momentum had shifted decisively in the prosecution's favor. The defense team appeared rattled, their strategies unraveling under the weight of Nichol's preparation. Grant, who had maintained his composure throughout most of the trial, now sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. That evening, as the courtroom emptied, Nichol lingered at her table, gathering her notes. Wallace watched her from the bench, his thoughts heavy. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to judge character, to see through the facades people presented in his courtroom. But Nichol Turner had challenged that belief, forcing him to confront his own biases in a way he hadn't anticipated. Miss Turner, he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. Nichol looked up, her expression neutral. Yes, Your Honor. He hesitated, then nodded toward her. Well done today. Her gaze held his for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. As she turned and walked out of the courtroom, Wallace leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day settling over him. Nichol Turner wasn't just a formidable prosecutor. She was a reminder, a challenge to be better, to see beyond his assumptions, and to truly serve the justice he claimed to uphold. Cracks in the armor. The courthouse was cloaked in a thick tension as the trial entered its fourth day. The corridors buzzed with anticipation, each step echoing against the stone walls, like a prelude to the storm brewing inside courtroom 7A. The stakes were higher than ever, with both sides sensing that the case was reaching its critical juncture. Judge Henry Wallace sat in his chambers, the early morning silence doing little to ease his restless mind. His usual routine, reviewing the docket, sipping his black coffee, felt inadequate against the storm of thoughts swirling within him. For years, he had been certain of his impartiality, his ability to uphold justice without bias. Yet Nicole Turner's presence had unearthed uncomfortable truths he could no longer ignore. She had become a force of reckoning, not just in the courtroom, but in his own psyche. Her poise, her precision, her unyielding commitment to justice, all of it had illuminated the cracks in his own armor. He had judged her too quickly, too harshly, and now every moment she stood before him was a reminder of that failure. With a sigh, Wallace pushed himself to his feet and donned his robe, the weight of the fabric, a familiar but heavier burden today. He made his way to the bench, the noise of the courtroom quieting as he entered. His gavel fell, calling the session to order. Nicole Turner, as always, was impeccably composed. Her dark green suit, a subtle shift from her usual muted tones, seemed to reflect her determination. She greeted her team with a few quiet words before turning her attention to the proceedings. Her focus was unwavering, her presence commanding. Even Judge Wallace couldn't deny the respect she had earned, not just from the courtroom, but from him as well. The defense opened the day with an unexpected move, calling David Grant to the stand. It was a risky decision, one that could either humanize him or unravel their case entirely. Grant entered the witness box with the confidence of a man who had spent his life wielding power, his tailored suit and polished demeanor, a testament to his wealth and influence. Vickers, the defense attorney, began his questioning with a practiced ease, painting Grant as a misunderstood businessman caught in a whirlwind of administrative errors. Grant's answers were smooth, his tone measured, but Nicole watched him with a quiet intensity, her pen moving briskly across her notepad. When it was her turn to cross-examine, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Nicole rose from her seat, her movements deliberate as she approached the witness stand. She stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "Mr. Grant," she began, her voice calm but firm, "you've testified that these financial discrepancies were the result of errors, not intentional actions. Is that correct?" "Yes," Grant replied, his tone confident. "That's correct." Nicole nodded, as if considering his words. "And you've stated that you were unaware of these discrepancies until they were brought to your attention by Ms. Connolly. Is that also correct?" "Yes." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Grant, as the CEO of Grant Enterprises, would you say it's your responsibility to oversee the financial integrity of your company?" Grant hesitated, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Well, I delegate those responsibilities to my team. That's why I hire experts." "Delegation is a common practice," Nicole agreed, her tone neutral. "But delegation doesn't absolve you of accountability, does it?" Grant's jaw tightened. "No, but I trusted my team to do their jobs." Nicole's voice sharpened slightly. "And yet, millions of dollars were funneled into accounts linked directly to you. Are you suggesting that these experts you hired acted independently, without your knowledge or instruction?" Grant shifted in his seat, his composure faltering for the first time. "I can't speak to their motives, but I never instructed anyone to do that." Nicole took another step forward, her voice rising just enough to draw the jury's focus. "Mr. Grant, can you explain why these accounts were registered under shell companies owned by you personally?" Grant's face flushed, his confidence slipping further. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize," Nicole interrupted, her tone cutting. "Mr. Grant, you're a seasoned businessman with decades of experience. Are you seriously asking this court to believe that millions of dollars appeared in accounts you owned, and you had no knowledge of it?" The courtroom murmured, the tension escalating with each of her questions. Wallace rapped his gavel for silence, but even he couldn't help but be drawn into the unraveling of Grant's facade. Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Nicole pressed on, her words relentless. "This isn't about administrative errors, Mr. Grant. This is about deliberate actions, actions that betrayed the trust of your investors, your employees, and the public. Actions that you have yet to take responsibility for. Grant's silence was deafening, his polished exterior crumbling under the weight of her cross-examination. Nicole returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. The jury's eyes followed her, their expressions a mixture of respect and certainty. She had done what she set out to do, expose the truth. As the defense scrambled to regain control, Nicole's team worked quietly but efficiently, preparing for the next phase of the trial. The afternoon was filled with witness testimonies, each one adding another layer to the case against Grant. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was heavy with the inevitability of the jury's verdict. Nicole lingered in the courtroom, reviewing her notes as the room emptied around her. Wallace watched her from the bench, his thoughts conflicted. He wanted to say something, to acknowledge the transformation she had wrought not just in the case, but in his own understanding of justice. But the words felt inadequate. As she gathered her things and headed for the door, she paused, her gaze meeting his. For a moment, there was an unspoken exchange, an acknowledgement of the journey they were both on. Then she nodded, a small but significant gesture, and walked out of the courtroom. That evening, Wallace sat in his chambers, the silence a stark contrast to the intensity of the day. He thought about Nicole Turner, about her determination, her integrity, and the quiet power she wielded. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to judge character, to see through the masks people wore in his courtroom. But Nicole had shown him how much he still had to learn. The trial wasn't over, but something had shifted. Not just in the case, but in Wallace himself. Nicole Turner had become more than just a prosecutor. She had become a mirror, reflecting the flaws he had long ignored. And as he prepared for the days ahead, he knew he couldn't return to the man he had been before she walked into his courtroom. The test of integrity. The fifth day of the trial began under an ominous gray sky, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. The weather seemed to mirror the mood inside courtroom 7A, where every word, every gesture, carried the weight of a case that had captured the community's attention. The air was thick with anticipation, the gallery filled with reporters and spectators eager to witness the next development in the battle between Nicole Turner and David Grant. Nicole entered the courtroom early, her steps purposeful as she approached the prosecution's table. Today, she wore a black suit with a deep emerald blouse, her attire as sharp and commanding as her demeanor. Her team greeted her with hushed tones, their movements brisk as they reviewed last-minute details. The defense table, by contrast, was a hive of quiet tension, the attorneys exchanging hurried whispers as they strategized their next move. Judge Henry Wallace observed the room from the bench, his expression unreadable. Over the past few days, he had watched the trial evolve from a simple legal proceeding into a crucible of truth and accountability. Nicole Turner had been the catalyst for that transformation, her unwavering pursuit of justice forcing everyone, including Wallace himself, to confront uncomfortable truths. As the session was called to order, the defense made their first move of the day, a motion to dismiss one of the key pieces of evidence, an email chain that directly implicated Grant in the fraudulent transfers. Vickers argued that the emails had been obtained through improper channels, claiming a breach of attorney-client privilege. Nicole rose to counter the motion, her voice calm but resolute. Your Honor, the defense's claim is both factually and legally baseless. The emails were obtained through a court-ordered subpoena, following all proper protocols. Furthermore, these communications do not fall under the protection of privilege, as they pertain to illegal activities outside the scope of legal representation. Wallace leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he listened to both arguments. The defense's motion was clearly a last-ditch effort to discredit the prosecution's case, and he saw through it. But what struck him most was Nicole's composure. She didn't just defend her position. She dismantled the opposition's argument with precision and confidence. After careful consideration, Wallace delivered his ruling. The defense's motion to dismiss is denied. The emails will remain admissible as evidence." The gallery murmured in response, the defense team visibly deflated by the decision. Nicole returned to her seat, her expression calm but focused. It was another small victory, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate. There was still much to do. The prosecution's next witness was a forensic analyst who had traced the fraudulent transactions to Grant's shell companies. Nicole guided the testimony with a methodical precision, her questions designed to illuminate the depth and breadth of the scheme. "Mr. Patel," she began, addressing the witness, "can you confirm that the funds in question were transferred through a series of accounts designed to obscure their origin and destination?" "Yes," Patel replied. "The transactions were routed through multiple offshore accounts, making it difficult to trace the funds. However, we were able to identify patterns that led directly to the defendant's companies." Nicole nodded, her gaze shifting briefly to the jury. "And these patterns, were they consistent with typical accounting errors, as the defense has suggested?" Patel shook his head. "No, they were deliberate. The level of complexity and the use of shell companies indicate a clear intent to deceive." The defense's cross-examination tried to poke holes in Patel's testimony, but Nicole's preparation had left little room for doubt. By the time the witness was dismissed, the prosecution's case had grown even stronger, the web of evidence tightening around Grant. As the trial broke for lunch, Nicole returned to her office to review her notes. The weight of the case was beginning to take its toll, but she refused to let it show. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, and she wasn't about to falter now. Back in the courthouse, Wallace sat in his chambers, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the intensity of the courtroom. He couldn't stop thinking about Nicole's words, her arguments, her relentless pursuit of the truth. She had become more than just a prosecutor in his eyes. She was a symbol of the justice he had sworn to uphold. But there was something else gnawing at him, a growing awareness of his own shortcomings. He had spent years in this position, priding himself on his ability to judge fairly. Yet he had failed to see Nicole Turner for who she truly was until it was almost too late. The realization was humbling, and it left him with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The afternoon session began with the defense calling a surprise witness, a former business associate of Grant's who claimed to have no knowledge of the fraudulent activities. The move was clearly an attempt to sow doubt, but Nicole was ready. Her cross-examination was sharp, her questions designed to expose the inconsistencies in the witness's testimony. "Mr. Harding," she said, her tone calm but pointed, "you've stated that you had no knowledge of these transactions. Yet records show that you personally signed off on several of the transfers. Can you explain that?" Harding hesitated, his confidence wavering. I trusted the accounting department. I didn't look closely at the details." Nicole's gaze didn't waver. "So, you're asking this court to believe that millions of dollars were moved under your watch, and you had no idea it was happening?" Harding faltered, his words trailing off. "No further questions," Nicole said, returning to her seat. The defense's strategy had backfired, their witness's credibility in tatters. By the end of the day, it was clear that the prosecution's case was all but airtight. The defense was running out of options, their arguments unraveling under the weight of the evidence. But Nicole knew better than to let her guard down. The verdict was still uncertain, and she couldn't afford to lose focus now. As the courtroom emptied, Wallace lingered on the bench, watching as Nicole gathered her papers. He felt a surge of admiration for her, admiration tempered by the guilt of knowing how he had judged her so unfairly before. She was everything he had once aspired to be, fair, determined, and unwavering in her commitment to justice. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. She looked up, her expression neutral but attentive. "Yes, Your Honor." For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on him. Then he said, "I want you to know that your work here has been exemplary. Regardless of the outcome, you've shown this court what true justice looks like." Nicole's gaze softened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." That means a great deal. As she turned and walked out of the courtroom, Wallace sat back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. Nicole Turner had not only reshaped the trial, she had reshaped him. And as he prepared for the final day of the case, he knew that whatever the verdict, he would never see his role, or himself, in the same way again. The verdict and the reckoning. The final day of the trial dawned with a somber gravity that seemed to pervade every corner of the courthouse. The overcast sky mirrored the mood of those gathering in courtroom 7A, where the jury would soon deliberate on a case that had gripped the public and redefined the careers of everyone involved. Nicole Turner arrived early, as she had every day, her stride purposeful and her expression calm. She wore a deep navy suit, her hair neatly pulled back, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they had given everything to their cause. But beneath her composed exterior was a swirl of emotions: exhaustion, anticipation, and a flicker of hope that justice would prevail. Her team was already waiting at the prosecution table, reviewing notes and discussing final strategies. Nicole joined them with a few quiet words of encouragement before sitting down and scanning the room. The defense table was a stark contrast, the attorneys hunched over their documents with an air of desperation. David Grant sat stiffly, his usual mask of confidence cracked and slipping. As the gallery filled with spectators, reporters, and legal observers, the hum of conversation grew louder, only to be silenced by the entrance of Judge Henry Wallace. His gavel fell with a commanding thud, and the courtroom came to order. Wallace's gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Nicole Turner. Over the course of the trial, his perception of her had shifted profoundly. She was no longer just a prosecutor. She was a force of integrity, someone who had challenged not only the defendant, but also the very foundation of his assumptions. Today, as he presided over the culmination of her case, he felt both admiration and a deep sense of responsibility. "The court will now hear closing arguments," Wallace announced, his voice steady. "Miss Turner, you may proceed." Nicole rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and composed. She approached the jury with a calm intensity that commanded their attention. For a moment, she stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but resonant. "Over the past several days, you've heard testimony, seen evidence, and witnessed the unraveling of a carefully constructed facade. David Grant, a man entrusted with the livelihoods of countless individuals, chose to betray that trust for personal gain. He used his position of power not to serve others, but to enrich himself at their expense." Her gaze shifted from one juror to the next, forging connections with each of them. "This case is not about wealth or success. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter how influential, is above the law." Nicole's words were measured, deliberate, and piercing. She painted a vivid picture of the harm Grant had caused, recounting the stories of investors who had lost their savings, families who had been left in financial ruin. Her voice carried the weight of their suffering, and her tone left no room for doubt. "Today, you have the power to deliver justice," she concluded, "not just for the victims of this case, but for the principle that binds us all: that the truth matters, and that those who break the law must face the consequences of their actions. I trust you to uphold that principle. Thank you." The courtroom was silent as Nicole returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. The defense's closing argument followed, an impassioned plea to cast doubt on the evidence and portray Grant as a misunderstood businessman. But the jury's expressions remained inscrutable, their focus unwavering. When the arguments concluded, Wallace addressed the jury. "You have heard the evidence and the arguments from both sides. It is now your duty to deliberate and reach a verdict. This court is adjourned until the jury has reached its decision." The gavel fell, and the room erupted into murmurs as the jury filed out to deliberate. Nicole remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her team whispered words of reassurance, but she only nodded, her gaze fixed on the empty jury box. Hours passed. The waiting was a test of endurance, the minutes stretching into what felt like eternity. Nicole alternated between reviewing her notes and gazing out the window, her mind replaying every moment of the trial. She had done everything she could. Now, it was out of her hands. In his chambers, Wallace sat alone, his thoughts heavy. He had presided over countless trials, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the magnitude of the case or the media attention. It was the reckoning it had brought to his own understanding of justice. Nicole Turner had shown him the flaws in his approach, the blind spots he hadn't realized he carried. He resolved that regardless of the jury's decision, he would do better. He owed that to her, to himself, and to every person who walked into his courtroom. Late in the afternoon, the bailiff entered to announce that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, the tension so thick, it seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Nicole took her seat, her hands resting on the table, her expression unreadable. Grant sat stiffly, his attorneys whispering furiously to him. Wallace entered, his presence commanding the room into silence. The jury filed in, their expressions serious but unreadable. Wallace addressed the foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, handing a folded piece of paper to the bailiff. Wallace unfolded the paper, his expression neutral as he read its contents. He passed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreperson. "In the matter of the State of Jefferson County versus David Grant," the foreperson announced, her voice steady, "we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Grant's shoulders slumped, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. Nicole remained composed, her hands clasped in front of her, but the faintest flicker of relief crossed her face. Wallace rapped his gavel, silencing the room. "Order! Order in the court!" He turned to the jury. "Thank you for your service. This court commends your diligence and dedication." As the room emptied, Nicole gathered her papers, her movements deliberate. Her team congratulated her quietly, their relief palpable, but she remained focused. This wasn't about her. It was about the victims who had been waiting for justice. Before leaving, she glanced up at Wallace, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. There was no animosity in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. Wallace nodded, acknowledging her not just as a prosecutor, but as someone who had challenged him to be better. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the city buzzed with news of the verdict, Nicole sat alone in her office. She allowed herself a moment of reflection, the weight of the trial finally settling on her. Justice had been served, but the fight for accountability was never ending. She was ready for whatever came next. In his chambers, Wallace sat in silence, the events of the trial replaying in his mind. Nicole Turner had left an indelible mark, not just on the courtroom, but on him. She had reminded him of what justice truly meant, seeing people for who they were, listening, and holding himself accountable for his own biases. For Wallace, the trial was more than just a case. It was a turning point. And as he turned out the light and closed his office door, he knew that the lessons Nicole Turner had taught him would shape every decision he made moving forward.